Hello, everybody. Welcome to yet another Rising Tide RT Talk. So welcome. I'm Matt, Roleplay Chat Capelli, and today we're going to be talking about editing in the tabletop RPG context, getting started as an editor. Maybe you're already an editor and you want some a little bit more advanced tips and tricks and whatnot. And today I'm humbled to be joined by an expert in the editing space. They are an editor and game designer with credits in all kinds of works, including Tigtone, Eldritch Sands, and a couple of really, heavy hitters, including the Mithril bestseller Gesh's Guide to Making Many Things. Please join me in welcoming Adam Hancock to our interview today. Adam, why don't you say hello?
Thank you much, Matt. Yeah, I'm Adam Hancock, and I guess I've already been introduced.
Yeah. Well, Adam, thank you so much for being here today, and thanks everybody in the audience who's here live tonight. One little housekeeping thing before we get going with the interview. For those of you who've been to these before, we've changed the formula a little bit for how we're going to take in your questions and comments during today's episode. So there is a RT Talks discussion, I guess, forum or whatnot, just above this one in the Discord server. And in there, you're going to see a post for this particular RT Talk. So it's called Finding Your Place as a TTRPG Editor. You're going to want to post any questions that you have tonight there. And in the last 15 minutes or so of today's conversation, I'm going to save that for your questions. So Adam, get ready for the unscripted stuff. That's where it gets real crazy.
Crazy with editing.
That's it. All the editing, all the amazing editing stuff. So folks, make sure you put your stuff, your comments or your hype, just hype us up in the RT discussions post. And yeah, so without further ado, let's start this conversation off. So Adam, today I'm hoping to cover editing kind of in three main pillars of conversation. First, we're going to just cover basics like the definitions and whatnot. Then we're going to get into some advice or considerations that you want to share with the people listening. And then the last one is just the recommended tools and resources that you have that you want to share with the world. All right. I know that sometimes definitions can be a little bit redundant, but I think in the context of what exactly editing is, surprisingly, there are some nuances there. So I wanted to ask you to kind of get a sense of what you consider to be editing in the TTRPG space. What do we mean when we say editing, and what doesn't count as editing in particular?
Okay, so if you have questions about Affinity or InDesign, I'm not your person because that is graphic design out, and I don't do that. That's not an editor's job. I'm also not a video editor. I'm not entirely sure what that entails either, so that's not what I do either. I think if I were to explain editing to a person who'd never had that done before and had never seen that process, probably just describe it as taking a writer's words and getting it ready for publication. We'd be looking at, does it read well? Is it coherent? Does it have good pacing, good wording? Does the writing flow? Is it free of punctuation and grammar errors? And in many ways, the editor serves as the first reader. It's kind of like in a very safe space, you are presenting your writing to your very first reader, and there's someone who is trained and or experienced to know how to be a first reader and also help you polish that writing. That is how I would define it today.
Yeah, that I love that. That's a really good definition. And for anybody here who had questions about InDesign or any of the other layout or graphic design stuff, I think it was maybe 2 months ago, we had Gordon McAlpin on RT Talks to talk about layout. So definitely you can, go back to that episode. Gordon shared some really cool insight with regards to layout. So now we're going to be focusing on the editing side of things. Like Adam very, very eloquently said, looking at the words, making sure that you're the first reader and that everything's ready for publishing. Speaking of things getting ready for publishing, what kind of projects, in your experience, benefit the most in having an editor? When should somebody working on an independent product consider finding an editor for their project? You can say like all the time if you want, but I'm just curious to know like when and why.
Yeah, I would say all the time, unless here's the one exception I might carve out. Unless you don't intend on making any money from it. You're not asking for any money in any form, then go ahead and do any like a good example would be if you are publishing under D&D's fan content policy, for example, or you're just putting something out there in the world and you don't expect any money from it, then I think that your writing would still benefit from having an editor, but that's the one exception I would carve out. In all other cases, I would say try to find an editor. And I could explain why that's my philosophy if you want.
Yes, please do.
So, a lot of people talk about self-editing, which I think is a misnomer. When I say self-editing, when people say self-editing, I'm always think revising, right? Because
Hmm.
a good writer will revise, right? They'll write their draft and then they'll revise and revise until they get it to a place where they want to show it to an editor or their first other person to read it. But for me, that's not really editing. It's a separate process, a very necessary process. It's different from editing. One of the reasons why you need another pair of eyes on it is that every person just has too many dead angles about their own writing, even including myself, right? I like to write as well, and I can't see my own mistakes, and they're invisible for most writers. Everyone from beginning writers to published writers. It's just too hard to see your own mistakes. You kind of know what you meant when you wrote those words, so your brain fills in all of those gaps. If you don't know a grammar rule, then it's really hard to spot it, right? Things like that. So getting another pair of eyes on it is really, really important before you just throw it out into the entire world.
Yeah, very well said. Going back to the nomenclature here, I know a few folks ahead of this conversation asked some questions in their TTRPG Rising Tide community about nomenclature. There seems to be a variety of different titles and terms used for editing, especially in the TTRPG space, it seems. You got like mechanics editing versus creative editing versus copy editing. To me, I don't understand the difference at all. So I was wondering if you could break it down a little bit for those of us who might be a little unfamiliar. And, what are those distinctions effectively?
I think it makes sense that it's confusing because there's even some disagreement. It depends on your background. You might have a different process. If you come from a background of where you edit for novels and then you come into the TTRPG space,
Mm,
you're going to have a slightly different understanding of what editing is and all the different people or all the different types of editors involved. But for me, it's this. So the first kind of editor is or structural editor. And if you want to hire someone like that, you want to bring them in probably before you do any serious writing on the project. You might do some outlining, you might kind of conceptually think about the core idea, but you want to get a developmental editor in there right away. That's because they're going to help you with the big picture things. They're going to be there from the very beginning, thinking about the structure of what you're trying to put together, thinking about the sections that'll be necessary. And so it's really kind of almost before you put pen to paper or fingers to your keyboard. And
hmm
then the next kind is copy editing. And I would say if you want that kind of editing, bring them in after you've written your first draft because they're going to look at your grammar, word choice, readability. They'll go sort of section by section, paragraph by paragraph, and line by line, looking at all of those things. But they know that like this isn't the final draft, so they're going to be kind of helping guide you in a general direction without sort of nailing everything down. So they're not going to like stress this comma is in the wrong place, but they are going to sort of give you good grammar principles and sort of clean up any language or point out any language that needs cleaning up, stuff like that. Or like maybe a section is missing, like you haven't explained this part, stuff like that. And then the last one is sometimes called proofreading or mechanical editing. The line for me between line editing and this kind of editing is a little blurred. So maybe depending on your background, those are two separate things, but they could be kind of the same. And that's what you want to do right before publication. So sometimes it's already a PDF and you're doing the final proofreading check. You're going through looking for all those little nitty gritty things. There's a page number missing here. You forgot a comma there, stuff like that. So they're looking at grammar, punctuation, formatting. So I really like divide it up, and you can divide it up further, and it's a little bit confusing. But really for me it's about those three different main editors: developmental, copy editing, and proofreading.
Cool. And they kind of sound like they live in different stages of your project's completion.
Yeah, they do. And ideally they'll all be different people, but I know that our budgets are so constrained sometimes, or project managers don't know the differences, that often I'll have to sort of ask, like, when I'm brought on board, like, where are we in this project and what kinds of things are you looking for? So I have to sort of like tease out, like, what kind of editing do they need now and what kinds of editing will they perhaps need in the future too? Will I have to go through and do copy editing now and proofreading later? So it just depends on where they're at.
Cool, 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 cool. And so this kind of segues me into our next pillar of the conversation today, which has to do with advice that you have and strategies that you'd like to share with us. And kind of speaking back to those roles and descriptors and kind of nomenclature, I suppose, of different types of editing. If there's someone here listening today who wants to become an editor, who wants to edit role playing games and hasn't, or is at the beginning of their career, what kind of advice would you have for them as far as picking one of these types of editing, or perhaps those experiences that would be best for folks to kind of develop in order to kind of break into the TTRPG editing world, if that sort of makes sense?
So the first thing I would recommend doing is getting familiar with the style guide that you will need. It's usually the Chicago Manual of Style. I'm holding a tome, the only way you can describe this book, that is as thick as my finger is long.
Whew. Okay.
And if you were an English major in college, or you've read really widely for a long time, a lot of this stuff will be intuitive and you don't need to read it cover to cover. But
Mm.
you will need to read certain specific pages, be able to look through it and get familiar with the structure of the book so you can find what you need quickly, so you don't waste a whole lot of time. And then we can talk about style guides more in depth later, but do find the style guide, probably Chicago Manual of Style for the industry. It seems to be the industry standard because it is for Dungeons and Dragons, and a lot of the industry follows.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next thing I would do is just find someone who wants another pair of eyes on something. That's how I started in this industry. I've worked as an editor, a freelance editor before, and I worked as a college instructor for freshmen who were writing essays for the first time in college. So I have that background, but to break into this industry specifically, the way I did it was I found individuals who were like, I have this adventure module and I need it edited or something like that, and they would pay me 10% royalty share.
Mm-hmm.
And I started to accrue this portfolio of editing that then allowed me to move away from royalty shares and start saying, I'll do a hybrid, a little bit of a royalty share and then a little bit of money up front, and then move all the way to being paid by the word for editing. And I wish there were a different way of doing it, but I can't quite think of a way of doing that unless you're already a famous editor in another industry. I don't know if there's another better way to break into this one specifically.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And I think that that kind of echoes some of the advice, kind of breaking into the various different roles within this space, not only for editing. So it's for people familiar with that kind of breakdown and that structure, or that approach rather. It's consistent at least with what people might be used to. I do like that you talked about style guides. I do have a question that I wanted to ask you about style guides, and maybe we'll just jump to it since we're already on the topic. And it's kind of a two-parter. So if you need me to repeat parts of the question, Adam, please don't hesitate to ask. But essentially, it kind of boils down to this idea that, like you said, the big companies, the big heavy hitters in the space often lean on style guides to kind of maintain a clean and consistent approach for their work.
Mm-hmm.
And for people who are uninitiated, you talked a little bit about what the style guide is. Could you talk to us a little bit more about why it's important, and what kind of other examples might exist out there? And then maybe we'll shift over to the second part of the question.
So, for example, in the Chicago Manual of Style, they're going to say use the Oxford comma, whereas in a different, like if you publish an MLA or APA, or I'm forgetting, I've used others, but they might say it's flexible. So you need to know the industry well enough to know which style guide to use. Often the project manager won't know what kinds of editing they'll need, and they might not have ever even heard of a style guide, or sort of they've heard it in passing. They're like, oh yeah, Chicago Manual, that's what most people use, right? If you're publishing D&D materials specific, Wizards of the Coast, their own style guide that is sort of layered on top of Chicago Manual of Style. So you would need to know that if you're doing anything with D&D as well. I think you can get a free copy on the Masters Guild, but it's kind of outdated now because they haven't updated it for like 4 years or more. And then in that case, or if you're playing a game and there's not a defined style guide, then you'll need to sort of just read widely among the published things out there and pick up the ways that they write, because it's going to be different depending on the publisher or the game system. And then I would say make your own style guides for specific projects, which I've done in the past. That just means every time you sit down and log, like every time you sit down and work on it, log everything where you had to make a decision. The spelling of this fictional place is always going to be this. For example, we're always capitalizing this organization's name. And then you have it as sort of like your own personal style guide for that specific project.
Yeah, yeah. I think that kind of touches a little bit on my second part of this question. And I suppose this isn't really a question with a definitive answer, but I'd love to get your opinion, Adam, on kind of where this responsibility of having a style guide falls in the indie space. You know, a lot of people in this community are making projects in small teams with very minimal budgets. And maybe, like you said, some of the writers have never even heard of a style guide or don't know what their style guide might be.
Right.
So it's having a style guide definitely isn't something that a lot of independent creators have the tools or the know-how on how to do. And but at the same time, I don't, it's not fair for that to fall necessarily on the editor either. So I'm just curious to know how and where can people looking to have an editor join them for a project go? How can they develop a style guide quickly? What kind of initiatives might you be aware of in this space to kind of develop some sort of new style guide template for independently created role-playing game products?
I'm not aware of anything like that, of like specific, of like style guides that are sort of industry wide. And I think that would be a great initiative if anyone wanted to tackle it. But I think that there would also always be dissenting voices who might say, well, I always want my character classes to be capitalized, and then the other people will be like, no, that should never that should never be capitalized. So I don't know how that would work, especially across game systems.
Mhm.
I'm with you in saying that I think the project managers and writers should have a lot of say about what shape a style guide takes, but it often does fall on the editor's shoulders to sort of put it in writing, I guess. Because often what I'll do if I'm not sure of something and I know that the project manager likes to be hands-on, I will ask them about specific questions like, hey, I noticed there's a discrepancy. Sometimes this type of thing is capitalized and sometimes it's not. We can go either way. What would you prefer? And some people would say whatever you want, and other people will say, yeah, I'd actually like it to always be capitalized. And you just sort of like go with that and then log, like keep a record of the decisions you make when you could go A or B.
Cool. And maybe it's because I know too little about style guides, but could a style guide be as simple as it doesn't have to be as big as the Chicago one that you mentioned earlier,
No, no,
but it
no.
could be half a dozen pages just with like rules about, like you're saying, capitalization and that kind of stuff. Would that be considered a style guide?
I wish I could pull up an example. When I worked on Supers and Sorcery with Sadie Lowry, we made a style guide together because there were two editors on that project. And the rules that we wrote down for how we were going to edit amounted to just a few pages.
Mm.
And that turned out to be a 100 something page book. So, no, you're not going to have this. This is trying to cover anything that might crop up in the English language. We're just trying to make one adventure or one campaign setting or something. And so those can be much smaller, much, much, much smaller.
Okay, cool, cool. I'm glad I asked. Maybe now moving on from style guides, again still in the advice section though, Adam, I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about balancing when you edit for clarity of language versus balancing the personal voice of the team or the writer that you're, the product that you're editing. Where do you draw that line? And do you have any like advice or strategies for people who want to try to strike that balance?
I think a really good editor will be able to polish a piece of writing and in that process only elevate or draw out the writer's voice. So, for example, I wouldn't want an editor to be rewriting paragraphs or even like entire sentences because I don't think that's an editor's place unless the writer was like, yeah, just do whatever you want. But typically it becomes a dialogue where, like, for example, if I don't know what a paragraph is doing, maybe I don't know what it's there for, maybe I don't understand the point of it, it's not my job as an editor to just rip it out or change it. It's my job as an editor to flag it and say, I and other readers probably will be confused by this paragraph. What was your intention with it? And then that gives the writer a chance to go back and look at that and make it make sense to me and then by extension the readers. We're really just trying to elevate the writer's voice. And so I think it's kind of a false dichotomy to say you can either have balancing clarity of language or strengthening personal voice. I think both can be served at the same time.
No, that makes a lot of sense. It's a good point. And by giving that answer, Adam, you kind of touched on kind of the next question I had for you. It has to do with kind of taboos, maybe, or editing no-nos. So I'd like to know if you have a list of things that kind of make you cringe when you think about editing and within the context of editing, maybe common mistakes
Yeah.
that other editors have made, you've made, that looking back on, you're like, oh, I can't believe I did that. We should try to avoid doing that moving forward. Do you have any examples of that kind of stuff?
What I like to do is to see the editing process as a dialogue between me and the writer, which means
Mhm.
I'm not just a red pen, right? I don't just go through and slash and mark things and say this is wrong and this is wrong and this is wrong and this is how to fix it. What I always try to do is to leave recommendations, not marching orders. I think there's two reasons for that. One is that writer is only going to become a stronger writer if I'm transparent about why I'm recommending a specific edit. Because then they're going to notice things about their writing that will then serve them in the future. And two, it actually saves me a lot of time in the long run because if I'm transparent about why something, like I'm recommending a specific change, then the writer will anticipate that in the future if I ever work with them again or just maybe later on in the project. But also, if I explain my reasoning, then they won't just sort of reject those edits or whatever, not knowing why I'm doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll be like, oh, I understand why you're doing this. And then they can feel comfortable accepting that change. Or, as is the case often, they're like, oh, that's actually not what I meant, but I can see why you got that idea. Let me change it completely, and then we can go from there. So that's a mark of a good editor, someone who's transparent and is like not just like making edits, but also making comments along the way saying, this is why. This is just for consistency because you did it a different way up here, whatever.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Cool.
I would say get a style guide. Don't leave home without one. And then just the commonsensical things that writers and graphic designers and everyone should do, like sign contracts and try to stick with them, ask for fair pay because that not only helps you but helps other people because it sets an industry standard. So stuff like that.
Yeah. Awesome. Awesome. So I think with that being said, let's move on. Speaking of, remuneration and other kind of tools and resources, let's talk a little bit about tools and resources. On the topic of, using style guides and other kinds of tools, I'd love to know what kind of things you use outside of those. Maybe you have like a favorite tool, a reference guide, or maybe software that you use in your day-to-day editing businesses. Could you talk to us a little bit about those?
So I'm a semi-professional editor. I think professional editors might scream at me for saying this, but I prefer to use Google Docs. And there's a few reasons why. One of them is that it's all in real time. If they're changing something, if I'm changing something, we see it right away, as opposed to sending files back and forth. I really like that you can just hit hyphen 3 times and it becomes an M dash. That saved me so much time I don't have to copy and paste from the internet. I need an M dash, type M dash, copy that, paste it in the document. That's really silly. But a lot of editors cheered when they did that. I can leave suggestions and comments in the margins, and almost universally, people don't have any problem accessing them. They don't have to buy Microsoft Word or, Microsoft Office tools or anything like that. And then I get notifications when they change anything. And then that's all I need. And so I really like Google Docs. I think a style guide is important. You can get one online if you don't want to buy a hardcover copy. I think that's kind of it, right? Bring your training and experience, but I don't have a lot of other tools besides that.
Yeah, Osno, that's great. And it's nice to hear that, the barrier to entry is effectively free. Like Google Docs, anybody can access. So that's really nice to hear that people wanting to get into this space have access to that. So that's really, really great.
Right.
Speaking of bringing your experiences with you, are there kind of places people can go to get better at editing or learn about how to edit? Perhaps YouTube channels or books or even like paid classes that they can attend. Do you have any particular recommendations with regards to that?
Yeah, I came from an academic background. As I said, I taught college courses for 7 years-ish, and that was my background. And as a result, I read a lot of books about essay writing and also about pedagogy, teaching writing, and that's my background. I'm not sure. I actually Googled, like, are there any YouTube videos about tabletop role play game editing? So many about writing, right? I couldn't find any about editing. So I would say that I recommend finding a group of editors, even if you're all novices, like to be able to talk to other editors regularly, maybe find a Discord server or channel that's dedicated for editing and post questions there, see what people are saying. I think that's a really, really valuable resource. Like having, I don't know if I want to call it a community all the time, but having kind of a business pool, like a water cooler kind of situation with other editors, it's a really, really valuable thing.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I think, I can't speak to it entirely because like I said earlier, my knowledge of editing is limited, but I do know that we have a lot of editors here in the Rising Tide Discord community. We have text chats dedicated to discussing editing. So please, if you're here and you have questions, use one another as a resource. I know we have a lot of really talented editors in the community, so
Hmm.
this is a good place to start, like Adam is saying, for that water cooler talk.
Yeah,
Maybe we could, maybe y'all can start a YouTube channel on TTRPG editing too. There seems to be a vacancy.
that'd be great. There is an editing channel in the workshop Tide Pools. So yeah, I'd love to see even more activity there. That'd be great.
Yeah, definitely. Cool, cool. So maybe now I'll ask the golden questions that have to do with money, being paid and whatnot. So
Yeah,
I know this is always a hard question to answer because it's very dependent on a lot of different things. But I'd like to hear, your perspectives, as it were, as kind of how remuneration might work. Are there standardized editing rates that you're aware of? I know there's all the different editing roles, but maybe let's go with kind of the more back end stuff. So the proofreading or maybe the line editing. In your experience, what might somebody who's getting into this with maybe a limited amount of experience, what could they consider to be kind of an average rate of pay, if you will?
yeah. And it's a fair question and really, really necessary. Also, really hard to talk about because we're all broke. And if we're not broke, we have a really well-paying day job. So, but there are guidelines. If you look at the Editorial Freelancers Association or EFA, they have, I think it's the-efa.org. They have a rates page. You can look at that. They do break of editing, so it helps to know, there's copy editing, line editing, etc. And they also break it down by a category because it's going to be different if you're editing fiction as opposed to editing an elevator installation manual, which I've done and don't recommend.
I can't imagine that.
Yeah, yeah, we're just sit in your robe all day and go, how did I get here? But there's nothing industry specific. Like you won't find anything that says board games or tabletop role-playing games or anything
Mhm.
like that. At least I didn't see last I looked. I think we're informed by like fantasy novels. That's kind of the closest thing. But TTRPG writing is its own beast. Like there's a lot of rules language. There's math a lot of the times, right? In D&D or Pathfinder or something similar, there are monster stat blocks or spells or gear that's like very, very specific and interfaces with the rules, and you need to know all that. And so it's its own
Mhm.
beast. And as a result, I would say find what is closest to what you're doing and kind of base your rates on that and do what you can live with, because I would definitely say if you're editing for less than 2 cents a word, it's there you're probably being at least a little bit exploited, whether the project manager knows it or not. And then if you're editing for maybe 10 cents a word, you're doing pretty well. And so that's sort of like, and anywhere in between those, depending on your experience level, you're probably okay. Now, we should probably talk about your passion level, because your pay rate could go up and down depending on your passion level. I've seen this is an idea that came from Sadie Lowry, who I've worked with before. Maybe didn't originate with her, but she's the one who taught it to me, which was that if your passion is way up here, you'd be comfortable taking a little bit less, like because you'll work through it faster, you'll be
Mhm.
more engaged, you'll be happier than if you're editing an elevator installation manual, right? It's okay to start being picky with the jobs you'll take on, selecting only really well paying ones or ones your passion makes up for a little bit less pay. So if that y-axis is passion and that x-axis is pay, then you kind of sort of see where how high your passion needs to be to do 5 cents a word or 3 cents a word or whatever it might be.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, definitely. So I'm looking at the clock, and I think we have about 15 minutes left to answer the questions that the community has sent towards us. So I'm gonna go and pick some of those out, and we're gonna work our way through them. So Adam, I hope you're ready. Like I said, this is the part that you can't be prepared for, if you will.
I'm ready. I should have made tea.
Yeah, that's it.
Except that.
So let's go with the first one here from Trevor. Trevor Sala asks, when do you recommend playtesting happens relative to the different types of editing? Before, after, doesn't matter, etc.
Again, different types of editing. A developmental editor will be there all along the way, so they'll want to be on board well before playtesting begins. I think if you're trying to make like a playtest document, you probably need a copy editor to look over it before playtesting begins, just to make sure that your playtesters aren't confused by the rules language or anything like that. And you can even specify this is just for playtest documents, so it doesn't need to be all nailed down with 5-inch nails. It's just this particular part of the project. So I would say, yeah, copy editor could come in after the playtest document is written, but before the playtesters see it. And then I bother with proofreading or mechanics editing until playtest wraps and and you're sort of like gearing up for final publication.
Awesome. Cool. Hope that answers your question. We'll go on to the next question here. This one is from Heather. Heather asks, what is the best way to showcase a writing portfolio? Is there an industry standard for this? And I think we can broaden that perhaps to be about an editing portfolio as well, because I believe I saw a question regarding editing portfolios too.
Yes, if you have a personal website, that is a great way to go. If you do not, you can do what I did and make it look like you have a personal website. I use Card, CARRD, which I guess originally was supposed to be just an online business card, but it's since expanded in features so that you can sort of build out a website a little bit. And I just have basic stuff like you can click on ways to find my other social media and stuff like that, and then just a thumbnail where you can click on my different projects and it have my rates there and stuff like that. Yeah, get your name out there a little bit. Hopefully, people find you that way.
Yeah, cool. There was also another question again with the about the portfolio, specifically about like showcasing your skill,
Mhm.
kind of proving your skill in the portfolio. In the editing space, how would you go about kind of highlighting that? Is it effectively how big the project is? Does that kind of equate to proving your skill? I guess I'm not sure. I'm wondering what you think of that, Adam. How do you show that?
I've heard a few different things. You can't be like an artist or even necessarily a writer. An artist can just sort of show you, look, and they can look at it for 5 seconds and already get a sense of what you can do.
Hmm.
Editing is trickier because if you've done a really good job editing, you are an invisible contributor. So, what I would recommend doing, or at least this is what I've done, and I haven't figured out a better way yet, is if they ask for an example of your writing, of your editing, then show them a piece of writing, maybe before and after. That's pretty uncommon. Usually they just want to know what you've worked on in the past. And honestly, I know sales isn't always an indication of quality, but they'll often look at this is a gold bestseller, so you must have done a fairly good job editing,
Hmm.
which isn't always fair, but I think that's kind of how they look at it. If you can get testimonials, let's say you have a really good experience with a writer or project manager, you can just say at the end, yeah, I enjoyed working with you. Would you mind jotting down a line or two that I can show to other potential clients? That's honestly one of the best ways because
Yeah.
then they can put it in words about, I had a good experience working with this editor. They helped me see this and this and this. Definitely would work with them again. And then you can take that quote, especially if there's someone relatively well known in the industry.
Yeah, I like that a lot. That's a really good recommendation, Adam. All right, let's go on to we have three more questions and we have 10 minutes. So I think we're good. Unless folks have other questions burning the back of their mind, now is your last chance to ask them in the finding your place as a TTRPG editor discussion. But yeah, so the next question is from Kirby. Kirby asks, if you're charging per word, how do you handle changes and rewrites?
It's a good question. So, so you don't have to charge per word. I do, but that's because I have ADHD and sometimes my per hour like my productivity varies and sometimes I'm an absolute wreck and my editing is very slow and other times I'm on fire and my editing is super fast and the only way I can charge fairly is by the word. But you don't have to. You can charge by the hour, especially if your editing rate is pretty consistent. I would actually kind of if I were to do this, I might actually, if they want to bring me in on the project and then maybe bring me back in at a later date to do a different type of editing, I would charge those as two separate rates. You want me to do copy editing, that might be 4 cents a word or 5 cents a word. If you want me to do a final proofread at the end, that would be 2 or 3 cents a word later and charge separately because you are actually doing two different jobs.
Mhm.
And I think that's appropriate. And if the project manager is on board with it, go for it.
Oh, that's a good answer. We also had a question again, I think about rates. Jola asks what you're thinking a typical word rate in the TTRPG sphere might be, and I think you covered it. So, Jola, I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, let us know. I'm gonna jump over it and go on to the next one. This question is from Heather. Heather asks, "How is the best way to approach someone to offer TTRPG editing services?"
Yeah, that's a good question. Over time, most of my clients come to me. It's been a while since I've had to like really go out there and push and shove for attention. But if you do need to do that, I would look for those kinds of social media posts where I've just started to think about working on this, or
Hmm.
I've got my first draft of this done. And just, I think it's okay to say, do you have an editor already? Can I provide that service for you? Which means you have to sort of be pretty vigilant. You can also, so there's on right here on Rising Tide, there is an editing portfolio. You can put your editing portfolio there.
Yeah, exactly.
And I know that lots of other Discord servers are like that. You can also market your services just like a writer would or an artist would on social media and say, I have slots open, right? That's the language we use. I have slots open. I can take on another editing project next week. Please contact me if interested. I think that's totally fine too.
Yeah, yeah. And to kind of piggyback a little bit on what you're saying there, Adam, the Discord community here, like Adam said, you can post your portfolio in the editing portfolios tide pool, Or you can also maybe look for collaborations or whatnot. We have a text chat called Opportunities, where often project managers or writers will post their project. That could be a good way to find opportunities to edit or contribute to a project. Or if you're starting out, I saw some folks kind of discussing back and forth. But when you're starting to get into the industry, perhaps you could post something in the collaborations page, looking for this kind of work in exchange for that kind of thing, etc. So that might be a good way to go about doing that. Let's keep going. A good Gamora boy asks, what about giving a discount in exchange for a testimonial, especially when starting out? I mean, I think it's your comfort level, but Adam, how do you feel about that?
I don't know. I think a testimonial would just naturally spill out of them if they've had a good experience with you. So I don't know if I would necessarily need to. I don't think that that idea would occur to me. But your your experience might differ from mine.
Yeah, yeah. It's all based on your own personal comfort level. Totally. All right. So I think that covers all the questions in the chat and all the questions that I had for you, Adam. So I wanted to, extend a sincere thank you for being here to talk to us about editing. I know I learned a whole lot. I'm now coming out of here a lot wiser as far as style guides go and the different, nomenclature for editing. So thank you. It's been a wonderful conversation. Before we say our goodbyes, I wanted to give you the opportunity to share any last thoughts you might have as it pertains to TTRPG editing. And then, of course, once you finish telling us those last thoughts, if you have any, please let us know where we can find you, where we can look up your past projects, hire you for a job, or even buy some of the material that you've worked on or some of the projects that you have brewing in the background.
Great, thank you. And thanks for having me here. It's been fun to talk about this thing that normally I don't talk about very much. I did want to say there are some times where, like, I talked about passion projects and I talked about your pay rate, and where those two combine sometimes is partnerships. I think it's totally appropriate to take a royalty cut when you view everyone in the project as a partner, right? This person and this person and this person, we're all making this thing together because we just want to see it in the world, and we're gonna make it even if it makes no money. And you're an artist and you're a writer and I'm an editor, and so we'll pool our talents together and make this thing. I think that's the perfect opportunity to say, and it's going to be a royalty split, right? But where it's something else, like you're brought in late in the game and they mostly want proofreading services and they're a project manager and they're calling all the shots, then I would start to wonder, this should be more of a rate, like a per word or per hour thing. So just keep that in mind. Sometimes the pay doesn't always have to be a per word or per hour thing. Anyway, you can find me on social media as Adam Makes TTRPGs. Usually I have a card website. It's adam-hancock.carrd.co. And you can find links to all of my things there, including links to social media and my listserv. And very exciting but kind of terrifying is I am doing a BackerKit crowdfunding campaign that starts tomorrow morning. So if you're interested in mythology, ancient mythology, or playing as a god instead of a mere mortal in your TTRPG, then come check out my original game. It's Playing God on BackerKit. You can probably just Google that and you'll be able to contribute to it tomorrow.
Awesome. Yeah, yeah. I wish you the best of luck with your project, Adam. I know backing something is no small endeavor and it looks really, really cool. I know that Demille has posted the links to those things in the text chat. So please go take a look if you're here. And if you're listening to us in podcast land, Adam, do you know when the Backer Kit project will end? Do you know what the timeline is for that?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's just through May, so May 1st to May 31st.
Easy to remember. A month. Perfect.
Yep.
Well, thank you, Adam. Thank you for being here. And I highly recommend that everybody go take a look at Adam's website. That would be a perfect example of a portfolio if you're looking to build one. And then be sure to follow Adam on socials. While you're at it, I'd encourage you to follow the TTRPG Rising Tide on socials as well. That's at TTRPG Rising Tide on Tumblr and X, mainly. I think Blue Sky too. Hopefully soon on other platforms, but that's where you find us most of the time. We'd also appreciate it if you spread the word. Tell your friends, tell all the other content creators that you know, all the writers and editors and podcasters that you know, to come find us at the TTRPG Rising Tide Discord server. By creatives for creatives. I've been Matt at Roleplay Chat on all socials, and this has been another RT Talks. Join us live in about a month's time on Thursday, May 23rd at 7 p.m., where we're going to be talking to Aram Varshian to talk about podcasting and creating your own podcast network. Adam, thank you again for being here. It's a pleasure.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. And everybody remember, a rising tide lifts all boats. We'll see you next time.